The boy appeared out of nowhere. That was how Richard Calloway would later describe it to anyone who asked, and many people did ask, in the months and years that followed. One moment he was alone at his usual corner table at Hartwell's, the kind of restaurant where the lighting was low and the prices were not listed on the menu. And the next moment, there was a child standing at the edge of his table, rain-soaked and shaking, with mud on his sneakers and a look in his eyes that Richard had not seen in a very long time. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. Richard Calloway was 53 years old, the founder and chairman of Calloway Medical Devices, a company whose technology was in operating rooms across 14 countries. He owned a 4-bedroom apartment on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago. He had a driver named Gerald, who picked him up at 7:15 every morning and delivered him back at 9 every evening. He had not sat across a dinner table from another person in 11 months. He knew this because he had counted. The boy was perhaps 11, maybe 12. It was hard to tell. He was small for his age, whatever that age was, with dark hair plastered flat against his forehead by the rain. He wore a gray hoodie that had once been white and jeans with a tear across the left knee. He carried nothing, no backpack, no phone, no umbrella. He stood in the warm amber light of Hartwell's and dripped quietly onto the polished hardwood floor and looked at Richard with those dark, serious eyes. Then he said very quietly, "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. Could I please sit with you while I wait for the rain to stop?" Richard opened his mouth. He was not entirely sure what he intended to say. What he said was, "Sit down." The boy's name was Joey Marsh. He offered this information without being asked, settling into the chair across from Richard, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had been taught that sitting in a place like this was a privilege and not a right. He folded his hands on the table. He did not touch the silverware. "Thank you," he said. "I won't take long. I just needed to get out of the rain." "Where are you going?" Richard asked. Joey looked at the tablecloth. "Nowhere right now." Something in the way he said it, the flatness, the complete absence of self-pity, made Richard set down his fork. "Are you hungry?" The boy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had the particular pride of someone who had gone without enough times to know that accepting help from a stranger was complicated. Richard recognized it the way you recognize something you have seen before in a mirror a long time ago. "A little," Joey said. Richard raised his hand and their server, a young woman named Claire who had been watching the whole interaction from a careful distance, came immediately. Richard pointed to his own plate. "Another one of these, please, and some bread." When Claire left, Joey looked up. His eyes were a deep, clear brown, the kind that seemed older than the face around them. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Richard said. "Where are your parents?" A pause long enough that Richard began to understand its shape before the words arrived. "My mom passed away, about 4 months ago." Joey said it the way you say a thing you have said many times in many different ways, trying to find the version that hurts least. "I don't have a dad. I don't know him. My mom she never talked about him." Richard was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain streaked the tall windows of Hartwell's in long silver lines. A couple at the bar laughed at something. Someone's phone buzzed twice. "I'm sorry," Richard said. "Where are you living?" "I was staying with my grandma, Martha. But she fell last month and she's in the hospital, and they said she won't be able to take care of me when she gets out. So I've been staying at a shelter on Oakdale." Joey looked at his hands. "It's okay. It's dry." He said it's okay the same way he had said a little when asked if he was hungry, as if minimizing the truth made it smaller, as if smaller meant survivable. Claire returned with a plate of the roasted chicken and root vegetables that Richard had ordered for himself an hour ago and barely touched. She set it in front of Joey along with a basket of bread and a glass of orange juice, and the boy looked at the plate for just a moment, just one unguarded moment, with an expression that cracked something open in the center of Richard Calloway's chest. Then he picked up his fork with careful, quiet hands, and he ate. Richard did not rush him. This was unusual. Richard Calloway was not a man who had ever been described as unhurried. His assistant, a precise woman named Diane, kept his calendar in 15-minute increments. He had once left a board meeting to take a call and never come back, because the call took 3 minutes, and by the time it ended, he had already moved on to the next thing. His ex-wife, Elena, had told him near the end that being married to him was like trying to have a conversation with someone who was always already in another room. But he sat across from this boy in the corner table at Hartwell's, and he did not check his watch. He drank his coffee. He let the silence be comfortable. "What grade are you in?" he asked, eventually. "Sixth," Joey said. He was eating with focus and deliberateness like someone rationing pleasure, making it last. "I missed a lot of school the past few months. But I'm going to catch up. You said that like you were sure." Joey looked up. "I am sure. Math is easy for me. And reading." He considered. "Science too. I want to be an engineer." "What kind?" "The kind that builds bridges." He said this without hesitation, the way children say things they have been believing for a long time. "I watched a documentary about the Golden Gate Bridge, how they built it in fog in the 30s, and people said it couldn't be done. And they did it anyway." He broke a piece of bread. "I think about that a lot." Richard looked at this boy, this rain-wet, mud-showed, entirely self-possessed boy, and felt something he could not immediately name. It was not pity. He had felt pity before, and this was not it. This was closer to recognition, the particular feeling of looking at someone and understanding something true about them that they have not yet told you. "My name is Richard," he said, and extended his hand across the table. Joey set down his bread and shook it. His handshake was firm, his palm small and cold. "Joey Marsh," he said again. "I know," Richard said. "You told me." For the first time the boy smiled. It was a careful smile, still guarded at its edges, but real in the middle. "Sorry. I forget sometimes." The rain did not stop for another hour and 20 minutes. In that time, Richard learned that Joey's mother had been named Rebecca, that she had worked as a medical transcriptionist from home, which meant Joey had grown up with the sound of her typing, a sound he described as like rain on a rooftop but faster. That she had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer when Joey was 10 and had not told him until she could not hide it anymore. That she had died on a Tuesday morning in October at home, in the bed she had shared with no one, with Joey sitting beside her holding her hand because the hospice nurse was stuck in traffic and Joey had refused to leave her alone. He was 11 years old when he did that. Richard did not say anything for a moment when Joey told him this. He looked at the boy across the table and thought about all the things a person has to carry quietly before anyone notices the weight. "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was," Joey said it simply, without performance. "She used to say that the best thing she ever did was me. I used to think that was embarrassing. Now, I think it was the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." He looked at his empty plate. His orange juice glass was empty too. "I don't really talk about her very much," he said. "The people at the shelter don't know me. And Grandma Martha, she gets confused sometimes when I bring it up. She'll start crying and then forget why, and that makes it worse." He was quiet. "It's nice to tell someone." Richard signaled Claire for the check. "Where do you go when the weather is like this?" he asked. "Usually?" Joey shrugged. "The library, if it's open, or the bus. The number 14 runs all night, and if you have a transfer, you can stay on for a while." He paused. "Don't worry. I know how to take care of myself." It was such a strange and heartbreaking thing to say. "I know how to take care of myself." From the mouth of a 12-year-old boy who had watched his mother die and spent the last 4 months learning to be invisible, Richard paid the check. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Joey Marsh with the directness that made people uncomfortable in boardrooms and had never once made him popular at parties. "Is there someone at the shelter who's responsible for you?" he asked. "A caseworker?" "Ems Patterson. But she has a lot of kids. Do have a phone?" "No." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and set his business card on the table between them. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, his name embossed in clean black letters. Joey looked at it like it had arrived from another world. "If you need anything," Richard said, "food, somewhere dry, help with something, call that number and ask for Diane. Tell her I said to put you through." Joey looked at the card for a long moment. Then he picked it up with 2 fingers carefully, like it might dissolve, and tucked it into the pocket of his hoodie. "Why?" he asked. It was a fair question. Richard had been asking it himself for the last 90 minutes. "I'm not entirely sure," he said honestly, "but I think you should have it." Joey called 4 days later. Not with a crisis, not for food or shelter or help of any obvious kind. He called because he had found a problem in his math homework that his teacher had marked wrong, and he was certain his teacher was mistaken, and he wanted to talk it through with someone who would engage with it seriously. Diane, who had worked for Richard Calloway for 9 years and had excellent instincts, put him through without hesitation. Richard was in the back of his car, on the way to a meeting, when his phone rang and a small voice said, "Hi, it's Joey, from Hartwell's. I'm sorry to call. Don't apologize," Richard said. "What's the problem?" The problem was a geometry question involving the angles of a parallelogram. Joey explained it clearly, methodically, with the same focused precision he had brought to eating the roasted chicken, like someone who had learned early that carefulness was a form of survival. He was right. His teacher was wrong, and Richard told him so, and they worked through it together, Richard pulling up a diagram on his phone and describing it, Joey scratching figures on what sounded like a paper bag. When they finished, Joey said, "I knew it. Thank you. You would have figured it out without me." "Probably," Joey said, with that small, guarded smile Richard could somehow hear through the phone. But it was faster this way. That was the beginning of what Richard, in the privacy of his own mind, began to think of simply as Tuesday calls. Joey called on Tuesdays, almost always between 4 and 4:30, almost always about something concrete. A question about a book he'd read, once a long and careful inquiry about how bridges distribute load across their suspension cables. Richard answered every call. He rearranged meetings twice. He did not mention this to Diane, though she noticed and said nothing, and liked him better for it. 3 weeks after Hartwell's, Richard drove to Oakdale Shelter on a Tuesday afternoon and signed Joey out for the afternoon, with the permission of Miss Patterson, who looked at Richard Calloway with the careful, measuring eyes of a woman who had seen many things and trusted very few of them. "He's a good kid," she said. "He's had a rough go." "I know," Richard said. "I'll have him back by 7. He took Joey to the Museum of Science and Industry because Joey had mentioned it once in passing. "I've never been, but I read about the coal mine exhibit," in the specific tone of someone not asking for anything, just recording a fact. They spent 3 hours there. Joey stood in front of the model of the 1893 Columbian Exposition and asked questions that made the docent blink and ask if he was in a gifted program. "I don't know," Joey said honestly. "I've been at 3 different schools in the last year." On the way back to Oakdale, in the warmth of Richard's car while Gerald drove them quietly through evening traffic, Joey fell asleep against the window. He did it without warning, the way children do. One moment awake, fully awake, and then simply not. His cheek was pressed against the cold glass. His breathing slowed. Richard looked at him for a moment. He thought about a boy who rode the number 14 bus all night when the rain was bad, who shook hands like an adult, and ate like someone who understood that food was not guaranteed, who had sat beside his mother in her final hours because he refused to let her die alone. He thought about his own apartment on the 42nd floor, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen used only for coffee, 11 months of dinners alone. He looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, reflecting off the wet streets, and he thought very quietly, "What am I doing with all of this?" It was Gerald who first said it out loud. Gerald had been driving Richard for 6 years. He was 61, a widower, with a daughter in college in Ohio whom he called every Sunday. He was one of perhaps 3 people on earth who spoke to Richard Calloway without any measurable degree of caution, and Richard valued this more than Gerald knew. "He reminds you of someone," Gerald said one evening as they pulled away from Oakdale 2 months after Hartwell's. Joey had just climbed out of the car and turned once to wave, a small, serious wave, before disappearing through the shelter doors. Richard looked at the back of Gerald's head. "Who does he remind me of?" Gerald glanced in the rearview mirror. His eyes were kind and direct, and said the thing his mouth was only deciding whether to say. "You. When you were young, maybe. The way you described it, once. Growing up without much." Richard said nothing. "Doesn't mean anything," Gerald said, turning onto Michigan Avenue. "Just an observation." But Richard was quiet the entire ride home. It was Richard's attorney, a careful man named Elliot, who raised the legal question that Richard had been circling for weeks without landing on. They were reviewing contracts one afternoon when Elliot set down his pen and said, "You've mentioned this boy several times now." "Joey," Richard said. "Joey." Elliot was 60, sharp, the kind of lawyer who made excellent decisions and delivered difficult truths without cruelty. "What is it you're thinking about, Richard?" Richard leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, Lake Michigan was the color of pewter in November light. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, about what happens to him, long term. His grandmother is in assisted living now. His case is with the county. He's 11 years old, and he's been in 3 schools in a year, and he wants to build bridges, and he reads everything he can get his hands on, and he doesn't complain about anything. And he stopped. Elliot waited. I want to help him, Richard said. Properly, not just Tuesday afternoons. Elliot studied him. You're talking about fostering, or adoption. I don't know yet what's possible. It's a process, Elliot said. A significant one. They'll look at everything. Your schedule, your home, your history. A single man in his 50s, no prior parenting experience. I know, Richard said. I know all of that. Why him? Richard was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a boat moved slowly across the gray water. Because nobody is looking at him the way they should, he said, and he deserves someone to look at him that way. The social worker's name was Priya. She was thorough and direct and made no attempt to be charmed by Richard's name or his address. She visited his apartment 3 times. She interviewed Diane. She interviewed Gerald. She spoke with Joey independently, in her office, without Richard present, and Joey told her, as he later told Richard, that he did not know what he wanted exactly, but that Tuesday afternoons were the best part of his week, and that talking to Richard was the only time he ever forgot that his life was difficult. She also spoke with Martha, Joey's grandmother, in her assisted living room on the north side, and Martha, who was having a clear day, a good day, held Priya's hand and said, "He's a boy who needs a home. A real one, not a bed, a home. There's a difference, honey. My Rebecca would have wanted someone to give him that." Priya wrote things in her notepad for a long time after that. The process took 4 months. Richard had been told it could take much longer. He did not tell Joey what he was doing, not at first, because he did not want to offer something that circumstances might take away. He knew what it felt like to have a door almost opened. He was not going to do that to this child. But Joey was not foolish. On a Tuesday in February, sitting in Richard's kitchen, while Richard made coffee and Joey did homework at the counter with the spread-out thoroughness of someone who liked having space, a luxury he had not had for a long time, Joey said, without looking up from his notebook, "Are you trying to adopt me?" Richard set down the coffee pot. He turned. Joey was still looking at his notebook. His pencil was very still. "Yes," Richard said. "If you want that." The pencil moved, one letter, then another. "I didn't want to assume," Joey said. "That's fair," Richard said. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to. Promise something that might not happen," Joey said quietly. "I figured." He looked up finally. His eyes were very steady. "My mom used to say that hope is brave, that it takes courage to want things." He paused. "I've been trying to want this. I was afraid to." Richard sat down across from him at the counter. "Are you afraid now?" Joey thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "A little," he said, "but less than before." The finalization took place on a Thursday morning in April, in a judge's chambers that smelled like old paper and lemon polish, with Elliot standing to one side and Priya standing to the other, and Gerald waiting in the car downstairs, because he had said he didn't need to come in and then shown up anyway. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at the paperwork and then looked at the boy and the man sitting beside each other in the 2 chairs before her desk. "Joey," she said, "do you understand what this means?" "Yes, ma'am," Joey said. He was wearing a button-down shirt that Richard had taken him to buy last weekend, dark blue, the kind he'd pointed to quickly and then looked away from as if pointing too long at something you wanted might jinx it. "It means Richard is my dad. Legally and permanently." The judge looked at Richard. "And you understand your responsibility?" "Yes," Richard said. She looked back at Joey. "Is there anything you want to say?" Joey thought for a moment. He was quiet in the particular way he was always quiet. Not empty, but full, processing, deciding what to bring to the surface. "I just want to say thank you," he said. "Not just to Richard, to everybody who did the paperwork and the visits and the interviews. I know it's a lot. I know kids like me are a lot of work." He paused. "I'm going to be worth it. I'm going to work really hard." The judge took off her glasses. She was quiet for a moment that lasted just slightly longer than it needed to. Then she signed the paper. On the drive home, Joey sat in the back of the car next to Richard and watched Chicago roll past the window. The April light was coming in sideways, the way it does in that city in spring, all gold and slightly disbelieving, like the sun itself isn't quite sure winter is over. Gerald caught Richard's eye in the rearview mirror and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. After a while, Joey said, "Can we stop somewhere? I want to call Grandma Martha." They stopped at a small park near the lakefront. Joey got out and walked a few steps away, Richard's phone pressed to his ear, and Richard watched him from the car, this thin, serious boy in his dark blue shirt, standing on April grass with his shoulders back and his face lit up, talking to his grandmother with an openness that Richard had spent 4 months slowly earning. He heard him say, "Grandma, it's done. It's official." A pause, and then, in a voice that was not quite steady, I know. I'll tell him. I will." He came back to the car and handed Richard his phone. "She says thank you," he said. "She says my mom would have liked you." Richard took the phone. He thought about Rebecca, a woman he had never met, who had raised this extraordinary child alone, who had typed medical transcriptions from a home office, who had died on a Tuesday morning in October with her son holding her hand. He thought about what she had carried and what she had left behind. "She sounds like someone worth being liked by," he said. Joey nodded. He looked out at the lake, silver bright in the April afternoon. A wind came off the water and ruffled the new leaves on the trees lining the path. "The shelter had a rule," he said after a while. "You couldn't keep anything in your bunk except what fit in a backpack. I had to get rid of almost everything when I went in." He paused. "I kept her picture and I kept your card. Those were the 2 things." Richard looked at him. "The picture," Joey said, "because she was my mom, and the card." He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something, turning a thought over carefully before setting it down. "I don't know. I just had a feeling about it, like maybe it mattered." Richard did not say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere along the path, a kid on a bike rang a bell twice and swerved around a puddle. "It mattered," Richard said. They sat there a while longer, the 2 of them, watching the lake, and the light, and the long, complicated spring arriving over a city that did not care what either of them had survived to get here. Which was, Richard thought, perhaps the best thing about cities. They kept moving. They didn't ask. They just made room. Then Joey said, "Can we get pizza?" And Richard said, "Yeah, we can get pizza." And that was, in its own quiet and unannounced way, the beginning of the rest of their lives.